Hi everyone, myself Jithin Joseph, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Kristu Jayanti College, Autonomous, Bangalore. Today we are going to discuss about an exciting topic, which is the Greek tragedy introduction. You will have a lot to take home from this lesson because it is filled with a lot of myths, exciting events, a lot of funny and good literature, and a little bit of history. So let us begin with the first slide. An introduction. Greek history is always referred whenever we deal with literature because we consider that Greek literature or Greek classical period as the beginning of the Western civilization or the beginning of the Western art and culture. So when we are dating back to the Greek literature or philosophy, we find that almost all the writers of the English literature or the European literature, they have referred back to the classical or eminent texts coming from the Greek literature or Greek classic period. So if you are trying to locate the Greek classical period as a part of the introduction, chronologically, I would say I would draw a kind of a temporal phase between the 6th century and the 2nd century BCE. That can be the most important period in the or range of centuries in the history of Greek literature. It is because of a number of reasons that we are going to discuss in the following slides. First of all, we need to get familiarized with the place where the Greek literature and the Greek art forms thrived. That is Athens. Athens might be a quite familiar place name for everyone who is familiar with the Greek literature. So Athens was one among the Delian League cities of the Greece, modern time Greece. It was one of the major cities in the central land of Greece and part of the Attica and region of 12 cities. If you look at the history of the Greece, political history of the Greece from the BCs, you might find that the political history, the political terrain of the Greece was constituted by 12 important city-states, which were also considered to be the predecessors of the first democratic form of government. So Greece from 6th century to 2nd century BCE was famous for a number of things. First of all, it was considered to be a birthplace of democracy, as I was mentioning. It was also considered to be the cradle of art and literature and civilization. It was also considered to be one of the most important places of trade and commerce during the BCs in the Middle East. Greece has got, or Athens in particular, has got a long history dating back to the prehistoric age, which has been transferred or maybe transferred through different narratives and myths all throughout these ages. And when we start talking about the history of the Greek literature or the political history of the Athens or the history of the region called Greece in general, we can't actually start talking without mentioning about Acropolis, the grand temple dedicated to goddess Athena. Goddess Athena was the daughter of Zeus, the great god of the Greek people. So Acropolis was a colossal structure that you can still find standing tall at the top of the mountains in Greece, which was also a center of a spatial orientation for every kind of activities that happened in and around Greece back then. So it is a very important spatial presence when we start talking about the history of Greece. So during the tyranny of the Pisistratus and his sons, Athens prospered. So if you're looking at, trying to locate the political history of the Athens, one of the most important cities, which was famous for its art and culture, we might find that the prosperity or the great time of the Athens started with the rule of Pisistratus and his sons, which lasted between 1560 and 1510 BCE. In 1580 BCE, a temple of Athena known as the Hecatomb Pridon was built, and it was being dedicated to Athena, goddess Athena. So it is a very important milestone in the history of Greek literature and art because most of these theatrical practices or the practitioners of theatre, the playwrights or the philosophers, were closely aligned with the god and goddess, or maybe the Greek mythology which involved the gods and goddesses. So in 1566 BC, Pisistratus reorganized the Pan-Athenic Games in honor of Athena on a 4 yearly basis. That was another important thing that was done by Pisistratus. He organized or conducted a theatrical festival dedicated to goddess Athena, which happened in an interval of 4 years, and which started in 1566 BCE. And we find all the like artists or the philosophers who came later were part of, or maybe were promoted by this particular theatrical event called Pan-Athenic Games. In 1480 BC, this flourishing city was captured and destroyed by the Persians. So when the city of Athens was getting more and more prominent among all other city-states, other 12 states, there was a kind of a clash happened between, or maybe there was a kind of a attempt of invasion by Persians in 1480 BCE. So Persians somehow managed to conquer Athens, and Athens was for a period of time under the rule of Persians. But they again retaliated and got back their rule. They got rid of the Persians, and they started to rebuild their nation again, a city again. And the period from 1461 to 1429 BC, known as the Age of Pericles, another important ruler from Athens. So Athens reached in its zenith in terms of political stability, cultural achievements, and economic prosperity. So this time was very important because this was the time when most of the prominent playwrights, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Oedipus were writing and performing their plays. And also, if you're looking at politically and economically, this was also the time when Greece was at its zenith of political stability. There was a long period of stability in terms of politics, in terms of rule and politics. And right after that, in the chronology of the history, we might find that a Peloponnesian War happened between the Spartans and the Athens, which lasted for around 25 years, and which was quite collateral and damaging for both the countries. And finally, Spartans somehow managed to conquer Athens, and the war had a great toll on the history of Athens thereafter. So it was a war basically to get the control over the Greek world as well as the Mediterranean Sea. And so far we were looking at the chronological order in which the Greek history was evolving from the 6th century onwards. Now we look at the major philosophical figures, or the philosophical figures we can find during this time, during the classical era of Greek literature or Greek classical era. In terms of philosophy, we should always start with Socrates, because he is considered to be the forefather of the Greek philosophy. Even though there were like many other philosophers before him, we always consider Socrates, or the tradition of Socrates, as the most important philosophical tradition, which later on being followed by many other philosophers. And the great tradition of Socrates is called the Socratic dialogues. It was a method of a philosophy which he practiced, and which were also taken up by his followers like Plato and Aristotle. Another important philosopher after Socrates is Plato. And Plato established academy, which was his institution for education, where he trained his disciples, and which was also a great place of learning and wisdom. And Plato was followed, or maybe succeeded by his disciple Aristotle. Even though Aristotle was a great critic of Plato, Aristotle had a immense influence, or maybe kind of a revisioning of the Plato's philosophical ideals. And Aristotle and his peripatetics occupied the Lyceum. Lyceum was the institution established by Aristotle. The capture of the Athens by the Roman general Sulla in 86 BCE can be considered as maybe the last important historical phase in the history of the Greek classic period. So after the Roman invasion, Athens became quite insignificant, and it could never come back to its prominence as it was enjoying for a long period of time, from 6th century BC to 2nd century BC. And after the Roman invasion, there were like frequent invasions by different empires from the Middle East. To mention few, we can find Byzantine invasion, or the Turkish invasion during the Turkish period. So Athens was under the rule of different kingdoms from the 1st century BC onwards. So that actually kind of take away the essence of what Athens was famous for, its art, culture, and literature. So we don't find any time Athens coming back to its prominence after the 1st century BCE. We should also talk about the Great Dionysia, which was a theatrical festival, which was a kind of a theatrical festival dedicated to the god Dionysius, and which can be found as one of the most important venues of the in the history of the theatre in Greek classical age. It was a theatre of Dionysius, the Great Dionysia, which is an event. It is a name of an event, and it was a major theatrical event in the 5th century Athens, held annually in spring around March. Playwrights competed to entertain Athenian citizens. There were around 1,600 attendees for the performances that happened during the Great Dionysia. And attendees excluded women, slaves, mitois, and metics. These were considered to be inferior human beings, subjects compared to the male subjects. So they were excluded. These are some of the common features of the festival of Great Dionysia. And the Great Dionysia had a very systematic structure in which it was conducted. It started with a pomp, a procession. Sacred statue of Dionysius brought to the theatre of Dionysius near the Acropolis. And dithyrambics sung by the chorus, giant palois carried to the honor of Dionysius, accompanied by wine and revelry. So it was a grand procession, very pompous procession, which exhibited the reverence or the veneration of the citizens towards the great god Dionysius, on whose name the festival was conducted. So another important schedules that we can find in this great festival. The festival was conducted in 7 days. The first day was a procession, as I have already mentioned. The second and third days, daily performances of 3 tragedies, followed by satire plays. And on the 5th day, which was dedicated for the comedy plays, and there were around 5 performances of comedic plays. On the 6th day, which was called the recovery day, the recovery from the excess and revelry. I mean, it was quite of a day for the leisures and fun and entertainment. On the 7th day, the winners of those performances in the competition were announced, and the festival was concluded, or festival came to a closure. And this is the basic structure of the Great Dionysius, the Great Dionysia, which was the fest of theatre and art during the 5th century BC. And that was also a venue, or maybe a great chance or exposure for all these playwrights to come forward and perform their plays. That's why we can find the literature and art forms of the great Greek classical era is always quite rich and great, sophisticated, because of this kind of festivals that happened back then. And looking at the major playwrights from this time, we can find Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, and others. Aeschylus is famous for his play Prometheus Unbound, and Sophocles is famous for the Oedipus Tyrannus and Oedipus Rex. Euripides is also famous for his great play called Medea. And there are other inferior playwrights which I haven't mentioned here. And we'll also take a quick glance on who was Dionysius. Dionysius was a god, as I have mentioned at the beginning. And what was important about this god, and why did they celebrate this god particularly, even though they had great gods like Zeus or Athena, who were having a lot of temples and a lot of festivals in their names. But Dionysius was the most popular god among all other Greek gods back then. It has, certain reasons that would suffice to this particular popularity of Dionysius, or the popularity that Dionysius enjoyed. He was definitely the god of wine, fertility, theatre, and revelry. So it was, he was closely connected with the common man, because the common man was also engaged with all these features. Like they were quite familiar. They were quite close to the wine and entertainment. And theatre was also a festival of common man, where they could actually come together and express themselves, or maybe relieve themselves by watching the performances. It was all about fun. So that is why it was closely connected with the life of the common man. And Dionysius was also the son of Zeus and mortal Semele. Mortal in the sense she was a human being, Zeus was a god. So it was Dionysius was born of Zeus and Semele. He was also called twice born. His major symbols were like he was associated with mask, theater, ecstatic celebrations. Grape wine was one of the symbols that is used to represent him, or drinking cup. When we find a statue of him, we find him holding a drinking cup because he was also the god of wine. In Greek theater, he actually held a great position. He was the patron god of drama and theatre, as I already mentioned, and celebrated in festivals like Dionysia and Bacchanalia. He also represents the cycle of life, death, rebirth, as well as balance between chaos and order. This was briefly about the Greek theatre. I was trying to give an introduction to the Greek theatre, where we got introduced to the playwrights from the time of Greek theatre. We also got to introduce a brief history of the political history of the Greece, and also we had a quick go through of the 6 centuries of the great Greek classical period. So in the coming parts, we'll be discussing about the playwrights and their works in detail. Thank you.